And you can't, and you also can't rank trauma necessarily. Like when I definitely had a better life having been adopted, but I was also traumatized by it. You have to wonder, well, if I hadn't had this constant, chronic, every day of my life, constant stress and anxiety and grief and loss of being adopted, yes, I would have had to face other issues in my with my biological mother or the man she ultimately married, etc. But would I have been better equipped to handle those because I didn't have such foundational trauma? You can't really go there and you can't really rank that. But I also, when I hear people say, well, I know someone adopted and they're just fine, I'm like, you don't know what they are because they can't talk about it.
That's Janet Sherlund, the author of a book on being adopted. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Adoption is often seen as a profound act of love. It provides children with an opportunity to receive love from people who are not their biological parents. It also provides partners who are struggling the opportunity to create a loving family, especially when they're dealing with issues like infertility. Family is often defined through blood relations, genetics, but adoption challenges the notion and suggests that family is who we chose to love instead. But Janet Sherlund, a wife, a mother, grandmother, and author of the book Abandoned at Birth, Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me, brings an interesting perspective. As somebody who was adopted as a young child, Janet recognizes that for everyone who's adopted, there are certain challenges, difficulties, a sense of abandonment, and even trauma that comes with the experience. As a child, Janet often struggled with feelings of a lack of sense of belonging, and it impacted her self-worth and self-value as an individual. Janet passionately tells the story in her book of her search for her adopted parents, but also tells a more poignant message about how we, as a country and a world, should look at adoption for what it really is, the traumas that are associated with it, and consider our policies and our approaches and our biases related to it. Today, we're going to discuss the experience of being adopted from the perspective of the adopted child. We're going to discuss the journey to find the people who brought her into the world. And we're going to discuss the trauma, the policies, and the things that can bring about healing for all who are involved in the process. Hey, Janet, I just wanted to start off by thanking you for joining. When we were not recording, one of the things that I had mentioned is that in my work in mental health, I've worked with a lot of people who are adopted, who are in a lot of different spaces, some great, some bad, but one sort of like common theme were the complexities around the impact of their adoption. And, it's really interesting to have those one-on-one conversations with my clients where, often they'll have wonder about the reason why they're adopted. Even the ones who know the reasons of the rationale will still have some wonder. And some will struggle with things like attachment or a sense of belonging or other things along those lines. And it was really fascinating to have those conversations. But I did notice, when I would look for resources for my clients, like, a good memoir or a good book that kind of where they could relate to it, there isn't a lot of public discourse that a lot of the public discourse focuses way more on the positives of it. So I just wanted to start off by saying I appreciate the fact that your voice is out there and that you are telling your story, because I think for a lot of those people, like the clients I was talking to, it'll be nice to have someone who um, out there in the public sphere who can relate to the complexities, because I think, those issues like belonging get compounded by feeling as if your experience is sui generis or you're the only one who's having it. So thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. And that is why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because I wish there had been a book like this when I was growing up that really talked about the reality of living the life of an adoptee. And most of what's out there in the public domain is the point of view of adoptive parents who we view as saints because they take child in and raise them, or the biological parents who we often condemn and judge in some harsh way, in some way of inadequacy. But no one's recognizing and understanding the experience of the adoptee, the person who's traded between those two couples and who is asked to live a false life. And the reality, the deep, very primal reality of that you feel, the visceral difference you feel, no matter how loving and wonderful your adoptive experience is. Two things can be true at once. You can be grateful for your adoption and have been traumatized by being adopted. And it is a visceral feeling of otherness, of not belonging, of something's wrong, what's wrong with me. And no matter how many rational explanations you've been given or understand about why you were placed for adoption, there's just a fundamental, very deep reaction to that of my blood, my mother, my birth parents gave me away. I wasn't wanted. What was wrong with me? And it's, you can understand issues that were beyond their control that maybe required it, but how you feel, is very different from what you understand. And I'm so glad that there are so many more voices now talking about, wait, this is what it's like. This is what you're asking us to live, a life that's false, a life that you feel as false and not real. And you've been disconnected from all of your heritage, from everything about who you are and where you came from. And you never get to see yourself mirrored in others. And you feel odd and weird and other your whole life. And no one recognizes that in you. So you feel like like something's wrong with you and you're dealing with this alone. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about it, and also grateful that there are so many more adoptee voices out there now. But there haven't been, and there aren't a lot of books that talk about the real emotional experience of it. And that's what I tried to write, not just the storyline, but I wanted readers to be able to feel that big black hole that most of us adoptees walk around with in our center.
Yeah, I want to ask you about your story, but you just made me think of a couple things. It wasn't today. It was a couple days ago. I heard this song by Riley Roth for the first time, and it's called "When God Made You My Mother." And in October of last year, I lost my mom, and it was
I'm so sorry.
profound.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It was profound. Like it was I knew grief was coming, right? And I think I learned that grief is not a temporary thing. It's something that you truly live with, right? You learn
Yeah.
to walk beside it.
Absolutely.
And I think another thing that I talk about a little bit less, related to that, is the emotion that I felt surrounded by friends, surrounded by other uh, family members, was a profound sense of loneliness. And I don't even know how to describe this idea of losing the person you were with at the beginning of your life, the one
Yeah.
person who you've always been with,
Yeah.
and to lose them and know that nothing, and this really I think ties back to your point about adoption, that nothing can replace this person. And in the song, they talk about, like, one of the lyrics in it says something like, "When God made you my mother, he knew who I needed. And, he picked you from the others. And I think the next line is he could already see. And I just think to myself, um, whether you're spiritual or not, there is a connection between mother and child.
Oh, absolutely. You were babies aren't blank slates. And so when you're in utero, you're hearing your mother's voice. You're feeling her rhythms. You're drinking her fluids, for God's sake. I mean, you are connected to that. That is your whole world, and that's your safety. And again, you may not have words as an infant, obviously, to think and understand that and process that, but you're experiencing that, and all that's in you and in your memory. When you're born, one of talk about how important it is for a child to be close to the mother, because that's the continuation of safety for them. That's the voice they heard. That's the smell they smelled. That's the cellular primal connection. And it is so true that when you take that child and separate it from the mother at birth, there's this primal wound. And when you hand that child to strangers, because virtually you're handing an adopted child to strangers, those people smell different. They have different voices. They move different. They are not the same as you. And the infant feels that difference. Just as if I said to you tonight, I'm going to take you over to that house over there, the first house that you see that you don't know the people. And you're going to live with them for the rest of your life. And they're lovely people, and they want you to join their family very much. And they're going to take very good care of you. And you're going to kind of recoil, and you're going to go, well, I don't know them, and it's going to feel weird, and I don't want to do that. But we ask infants to do that, but no choice of their own, and with no defenses. And they are not blank slates. They're experiencing all of that. And so that really primal connection, there's nothing deeper and more primal than that connection to mother. And I remember my husband saying this, and I put it in the book at one point. He said, it's such a deep connection. He goes, the dying soldier on the battlefield calls out for his mother. I mean,
Yeah.
there is at the end of our lives, there's still a reaching back for that safety and that primal connection. So it is real. And we ask infants to accommodate this without recognizing what we're asking of them. And there are pictures, which I never saw before, of me right after I was adopted, and my parents brought me home to their home, and were introducing me to my brother and my grandmother and all that. And in every single picture, I am open mouth screaming. And they never showed me these photographs. I only found them after both my parents died, and I was cleaning out the house. And I understand why they didn't show me. I mean, you can see the terror on my face. I was 5 or 6 weeks old, and I'm like, where am I? Who are these people? Why don't they? And they obviously kept just passing me around as I was screaming and taking more pictures. Like, there was no pictures of me happy or calm. And and I had lovely, parents. I had a fine adoptive experience, but there's so little recognition of what an infant and child experiences. And it's so beyond our words and our understanding what it means to belong and to identify with our heritage, all that came before us, the people that surround us. And even if, when I was young, I'd say, oh, I really wished I could see someone who looked like me, and my friends would say, oh, that's not important. I don't look like my parents, or I don't even have the same interests as my parents. But it's only not important if you have it. If you don't have it,
Right. Because you're able to pivot off of, make the choice, right?
yeah, and seeing familiarity, and, oh, look at I kind of look like Aunt Betty, or I kind of look like Uncle Bob, or I have the same interests of Grandma or something. And you also, if you are very if you don't follow the mainstream in your family tree, and but you something to push against, like, I'm not like those people, I'm different. But when you're adopted, you have nothing. You don't have anything to push against. There's absolutely, well, for certainly adoptees like myself who were adopted in the baby scoop era and then closed adoptions, there's nothing about yourself, and no one else who's anything like you.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, you mentioned heritage, you mentioned the sound of your mother in utero, the sounds, you mentioned people that look like you in history and culture. And it made me think of a couple different things. And one of which is, when it comes to Native Americans, the United States of America has gotten a lot of things wrong. But I do think the Indian Child Welfare Act that they passed in the 1970s was a great idea, which was that Indian children were in foster care or in adoption cases, their tribe got the first shot.
Yeah.
Then Native Americans got the next shot before they would be adopted to other families, usually white families. And I think it's interesting that recognition of the importance of culture and history and heritage and familiarity that you're kind of getting at. And you just made me really think about that in a different way. But it also made me think about the one added layer. And I know people talk about like the downside of not knowing your health history, right? Like there's a family history of diabetic or of diabetes or something else like that. But I think in the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of research has emerged about epigenetics, that
Mhm.
idea that certain events are imprinted onto us. And someone described to me this study. And, I've read stories about the twin studies where twins who are separated at birth meet each other and they have the same mannerisms and
Yeah.
voices.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how powerful it is. But in the one of the epigenetic studies, they were looking at trauma, and they took mice, and because you can't do this on humans, they shocked the mice, and then they exposed them to the smell of apple blossoms. And then the next generation of mice, unlike any other mice, were became fearful when they smelled apple blossoms. That there's certain things that are passed down, history,
Yeah.
culture, epigenetics,
Yeah.
that in a way, I wonder whether for you, as someone who's adopted, it's almost like you're on an island and you can't get access to all these things that are about you because a biological child, your mother can tell you, well, your grandmother was just like that, or your
Mhm.
grandfather went like that, or this happened in our family
Yeah.
history. But there's this deep sense of almost like a breaking of the
Well,
history.
there's an actual term for it. It's called genealogical bewilderment. And there's this socially unrecognized trauma, and genealogical bewilderment came about, the term, because they were realizing that in adoptees, there's the power of biological origin and what it means to belong, and that normal psychological development requires knowledge of identity and heredity. And that is taken from adoptees, and you don't have that. And people don't respect it or understand it in our society, but it's very real. And those of us who have been asked to live without it can tell you how the trauma that leaves, the 7 core issues of adoptees: separation and loss, trust, rejection, guilt and shame, identity, intimacy, loyalty, mastery. These are all how it affects us. And it's not just, these issues don't just apply to things that happened in the past, the system of closed adoption. They're still part of our discussions today. Donor conceived individuals, when people are saying, oh, it's not important that they know their father's identity. Well, yeah, it is. Reproductive rights, what you're asking children to, the life you're asking the child to live who's born without being wanted. Um, there are so many issues that we are facing today, and without an understanding of these issues of belonging and identity, and uh, we are not well equipped to
Yeah.
answer those questions that continue and that are evolving in different ways in our society. And the as you were talking about, the Indian Welfare Act, and there was an article in the New York Times a few months ago about the foster care system in Colorado, and how the woman running that until recently was still rejecting kinship adoption applicant. Like, if there was a child to be in the foster care and there were family members that wanted that child, she would reject them in favor of, you know, financially healthy white parents. And that is, again, you're looking at such superficial, just because a family is more financially well off, or doesn't mean they're going to make better parents. And for that child, there's nothing more important to their foundational health and ability to grow into a healthy human being than being with their own people, their own blood. And it just crime, I think.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background, but before something you just said, and I wonder whether that's the rub. There were sort of two things. I was thinking in a way when you described that sense of loss and emptiness, it really did remind me of like the loneliness I felt after my mom, that there was a breaking of my sense of belonging because there was something that broke there. And I can't imagine what it would be like to live your entire life without that. And maybe the rub in this is exactly what you were honing in on. And I wonder whether when we're looking at something like adoption, taking that example from Colorado that you just gave, we're looking at like one value.
Yeah.
Researchers say there are like 12 to 14 different values depending on what research you look at. And those are core values, and then under those values you have cultural things that impact them. But we're looking maybe at the financial piece of it,
Right.
and we're ignoring all the other pieces that bring value and richness and fulfillment and a sense of belonging to life.
And you can't, and you also can't rank trauma necessarily. Like when I definitely had a better life having been adopted, but I was also traumatized by it. And you have to wonder, well, if I hadn't had this constant, chronic, every day of my life, constant stress and anxiety and grief and loss of being adopted, yes, I would have had to face other issues with my biological mother or the family, the man she ultimately married, et cetera. But would I have been better equipped to handle those because I didn't have such foundational trauma?
Mm.
You can't really go there, and you can't really rank that. But I also, when I hear people say, well, I know someone adopted and they're just fine, I'm like, you don't know what they are because
Yeah,
you can't talk about it.
from my work, I would tell you there's not language for
Well,
it. Like,
and I look like the perfect example of a successful life, and yet I lived with such trauma, and it affected me in a lot of ways. But one of the things many of us who are adopted do is try to be the perfect person because we so want to secure our place in that adoptive family and never do anything, wrong or bad. We want to.
because there's probably a greater fear. Like,
Yeah,
as a biological child, I know sort of, and I'm going to exaggerate here, I could go, as the saying goes, shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, my mom's still going to love me.
yeah,
Right. But I wonder if, as an adoptive child, no matter how much love you see, there's a part of you that knows that they did not bring me into this world. They are not, and I'm using this a metaphorical phrase, they're not my blood. So the threshold
yeah.
for being abandoned is a lot
Yeah, I
lower.
mean, I was abandoned once by the people who I was.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so just because someone's good or successful doesn't mean they're not coping with and struggling against trauma. And also, everyone deals with it differently. Sometimes people, drugs and alcohol to numb it, or go into deep denial, or become perfectionists or overachievers. Sometimes they don't face it until they lose their adoptive parents, or until they have an illness or a career crisis. Or I had one woman tell me that her mother in her 90s on her deathbed, who had been adopted and never searched, on her deathbed said, I am so sorry I never found out who I really am and who my family is. Please, you do that now, and you answer that
Wow.
family. So it's not like just because someone isn't facing it at a certain moment in their life or for a majority of life, it doesn't mean it's not there. It means they're coping with it in the way they best can. And
And
but you can't look at superficial markers of success and measure the institution by that. And by the way, it is an institution. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the industry needs babies. And so there's marketing that goes into this. It's mind-boggling what really happens. It's not just it's not a Hallmark movie. And so it's, your eyes have to be opened by all of those things to really understand.
Work takes up most of your time. That's why you should use Stamps.com to save time with your mailing and shipping, and have flexibility to focus on more important things. Stamps.com can handle all your mailing and shipping needs with rates up to 88% off USPS and UPS. Add flexibility to your day with Stamps.com. Go to Stamps.com/program to sign up for a special offer. No contract, cancel anytime. That's Stamps.com/program.
I used to work in an office beside an adoption firm, and it was something else to see it.
Yeah.
And something else to see the people coming in and out. So it was really interesting. So they had one office, and it was just like beautiful, and it was in this wealthy area, and that's where they brought the parents who wanted to adopt, but they never brought the families that were adopting.
Mm-hmm.
It was very, very fascinating the way that it worked. They worked with other adoption agencies as well as their own. And it was really, it felt very uncomfortable on some levels to watch it happening
Yeah.
from the outside as a business. And it was, because it's, what are you profiting off of really here?
Yeah.
You made the point. Well, you made a point that made me just the point about, like, in some ways you lived a better life. Maybe not. I had never thought of this, but my clients who were adopted, and this is just a guess, I would say out of 80% of them, probably, if somewhere around 80% of them were showing no signs of, let's say, trauma or dysfunction to their friends, to their schools. And that almost always when they were coming in, their parents had just begun to see it, or the kid had pushed for some kind of help on their own. You know, there was a much smaller group that were, showing signs. They were getting into trouble. They
Yeah.
were, skipping school or whatever. And, something I just thought about that was really interesting is that the ones who were getting in trouble and were not getting rejected by their parents for the ridiculous things they were doing, I always felt they were just kind of testing them, right? Like they were ramping it up.
That's a common reaction too. Yeah.
But one interesting thing about them, I think it was easier for them to get to the I'm loved and I'm not going to be abandoned in the process
Yeah.
because they had tested the limits.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was much harder for the other ones. I wonder what that's about.
Yeah. No. And that's kind of like half the adoptees will try to be the perfect child. And I was grown up. There are 4 of us, and we were all adopted from different families. And 2 of us kind of did the, do everything right thing. And 2 of my siblings just acted out and tested the limits and pushed the limits all the time. And it is a form of testing to see about your security. But, there's also, I tell the story, even though I had, very educated, loving parents, it's difficult for the adoptive parents too, to not see themselves reflected in their children and to reach their genealogical end, with their infertility and be uncomfortable with what they don't understand. And my older brother, who's 18 months older than me, just acted out continually and tested the limits. And that was really hard for them. And I remember hearing my mother say, when we were like, junior high school age, she turned to one of her very good friends, and my brother had gotten in trouble again. And she said, at least we can take comfort in the fact that he's not really ours. So there's this, there's also that kind of thing that happens in adoptive parents and children, is when there's such a breach of sort of understanding or getting them. They're not anyone who they're not anyone in your family that you recognize. There's someone, this is someone else's child you're raising, and yet you know nothing about their family. And I think there can be these gaps in, connection. You're together, but you don't belong together. And so it can go both ways. The child can feel like, I feel something's wrong, but the parents can feel that too. And that's not a healthy situation to
and
not
I am
identify and talk about.
And in one case that I dealt with, it was actually the grandparent, one of the grandparents who was nearby, who was having kind of like this negative discomfort reaction. And we were able to get her off to see someone. But I was going to ask you just a little bit about your background, like the story of your sort of birth and adoption, and what you know and what you don't know.
Well, I was adopted in the 50s in New Jersey, where my birth records, interestingly, are still sealed. And my birth parents, which I ultimately found out, late in life, my birth parents were high school sweethearts. They'd been dating for a couple of years. After graduation, my birth mother got pregnant at like age 18 and never told my biological father. He didn't know until he was 75 years old that he had fathered a child at 18. Um, and
Oh, wow.
and my birth mother, didn't deal with the whole thing well. She went and she was in total denial, and so she didn't recognize the fact that she was pregnant for 6 months, and then went to live with her sister for 3 months. Had me, and never the agency, the notes they have about her were very unusual. They found her behavior very unusual. They said they never see that level of denial in a birth mother. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't help in any way. She had me, went to the hospital and had me without any plan to what to do with me. The original plan she had fell through. And
Mm.
so she just left me in the hospital, and I guess a nurse at the hospital gave her the name of a adoption agency to call, and they came and got me about a week later out of the hospital. I was then in foster care for about 5 weeks, and then adopted by my parents, who already had adopted a boy who was 18 months older than me, and ultimately adopted another son 18 months younger than me, and then 7 years younger than me. We adopted my younger sister. So they ultimately adopted 4 children from the same agency. And we had a perfectly fine upbringing. I had educated parents. My father was an electrical engineer, very successful. My mother was, had a PhD and loved to teach. And we lived in a great town in suburban New Jersey. But you felt it. You felt, we all knew we were adopted from the get-go. It's part of our bedtime story, how we came to be. And I remember going to pick up my little sister from the agency, and they presented her in this fancy cradle. But we never talked about what it meant or how it felt. It was just a fact of our lives. And you just felt different sitting around the dinner table at night. We all were like individuals. We had different DNA. No one felt the same. We were participating but not belonging. And I every single day of my life wondered where I really came from and who I really was.
Participating but not belonging. What do you
Yeah.
mean by that?
Well, we knew we were a family. We felt like we were a family, but it was like you were at a meeting, or if you were with a group of friends or something, or people you're familiar with, but we didn't belong to each other. We didn't share any traits. We didn't share appearances. There's a very different feeling if you're sitting in a room with even really close friends, like your best friend, people you just love, and they're friends. You feel good, but there's a different feeling when you're in a room with your family. It's a deeper level of connection and belonging. Whether you like it or not is another thing, but it's a different feeling than being with friends. So sitting around the dinner table, we all recognized each other. We were a family. We lived together, but you just felt separate. I felt like each of us, no one shared blood around that table. We were all unique individuals.
It sounds like, and it sounds like to some extent you have some gratitude for that. But it reminds me of that phrase, the ties that bind. And I remember looking up like the history of that phrase and what it meant, and kind of coming to the conclusion that what they're really talking about as the ties that bind are these shared values, beliefs, characteristics that are shared between or among people, and they create this unbreakable connection. And it's almost like
Yeah.
you didn't have that unique unbreakable
Yeah.
connection.
You weren't
Like,
you weren't born into a clan. You weren't with the people who will, like going back to you're not with the people who would defend you simply because you were a part of the clan,
yeah,
for no other reason than you were there. You didn't have that.
yeah, I tell people all the time, if most people in my circle, including most of my close friends, committed a murder and I was the only one who knew about it, I'd be like, I'm on Team America, so I'll be the first to rat you out. But I said, if my brother did it, there's no way on earth I would ever, because we have a tie that it's the only tie that I can think of. Maybe my parents, but certainly my brother is the only tie I can think of that would allow me or cause me to go against every value I have.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you don't get that as an adoptee. And I remember, um, when I got married and, my husband, I had a hard time in many cases understanding the loyalty he had to his family, especially when family members were, you know, acted odd or strange. I didn't understand that biological tie. To me, it was like, well, just, just don't be around them. Or, there was, and I'm not like that. I mean, I'm a very loyal, committed, connected person, but there was definitely this lack of my I didn't have that experience. I didn't really understand what real family meant.
Yeah,
And
what how you can tolerate and love someone. Like, it's one of the few spots, and it really made me think of this because I'm not, not denigrating adoptive parents because I think many of them are good and many of them are trying as best they can, but there are limitations to what we can do. That I think family is one place, and it's not just family, where unconditional love comes easy, right?
yeah,
And in most relationships, even when you have unconditional love for someone, love is unconditional, but tolerance isn't.
yeah, yeah.
And family can be an exception to that, where tolerance can get as high as as the love. When was it that growing up you sort of felt or recognized that there was something different about your experience compared to the experiences of those around you?
I always knew it. I always felt it. Again, like when I'd speak out and say something to a friend about, oh, I wish I could see, and they dismiss me. I wouldn't understand it, but I'd go, they don't understand. They're having a different experience than I am. And but I don't have words for it, or I don't fully understand it, and they can't understand me. I wish I could explain it to them. So you just had this gut feeling and understanding that my experience is different and it's not the same and it's not normal, quote unquote. And my reaction to that trauma, and I had terrible panic attacks, acute anxiety starting in adolescence, 11 or 12. And I think, yes, my body was probably a body that over responded with adrenaline to anxiety, but it was also living with that chronic, I mean, literally every day of my life, look in the mirror and saying, who am I? Where did I come from?
Mm.
Every day, looking at every time I was out in public, I would scan the crowd to see if I could see someone who looked like me. When someone would say to me, "Oh, you know who you look like?" I go, "Who? Like, where are they?" I mean, it was, it's such a strange, lonely, disconnected, sad, alone feeling. And then things like normal development things like separation from your parents or the idea of death. Those things really slayed me. I mean, I had such a hard time separating from my adoptive parents at the right ages because I was already felt detached and alone and scared, and it was just my only tether was them. And then, the idea of eternal aloneness and loss and death was, blew my mind more than, I mean, everyone deals with that. It's a hard concept for as you're growing up to take that on, but it really threw me. And they I again, but I was a great student and I was a polite child and I was doing all the right things and looking all the right ways and just suffering inside and quaking and avoiding situations. I didn't go places and didn't do things I avoided things and wasn't free to make decisions based upon what I wanted to do. It was keeping myself feeling safe. And so I limited my life.
The way that played out for you was being perfect for these people
Yeah. And,
who
and
adopted me.
And so you can't be free. You can't be free to even have normal emotions. I couldn't express anger or fear. It was like, I mean, a lot of people who try to live a life like that, are just prisoners of that desire to please. And yes, I was female, and yes, I grew up in a time where that was even more prevalent, but it was even deeper than that. And it was just, and part of why I was doing that was because I was a grateful adoptee. And I didn't write my book until both my adopted parents had passed away. I was in my 60s. They they were they had been in their 90s when they passed away. So the the pressure that you're under to both
Mm.
honor and please these people that adopted you and find a sense of self
And help them feel
doesn't
like they did a good thing and showing your gratitude and remaining safety. Your book's called Abandon My Birth, and then the subtitle is Searching for the Arms That Once Held Me. And I think it's beautiful. And I wonder, though, in thinking about those things, like that desire to please for you is the way that it played out. I'm curious about what the process was like for you to decide to search out your birth parents and whether that was difficult and complex, because I know a lot of people who are adopted, often when they'll tell me, and this is even beyond my clients, that they're planning to search for their birth families, like the next thing that comes out of their mouth is, I don't want my parents to feel rejected, some version
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
Like, what was that process like for you?
Well, it was something I've felt every day of my life since I was a little kid, and I wanted to find out who my mother. I didn't really think about a birth mother.
Like, who more than an adopted child would be sensitive to that idea of rejection for their adopted parents, right? Because if
Yeah.
you're rejected from birth.
Yeah, you just feel like you weren't wanted. There's something wrong with me. I wasn't wanted. And no matter how many facts, like I said, or rational, intelligent thought you have to counteract that, that's still the feeling you get. It's like they say when kids who have parents that argue all the time feel like it's their fault, and clearly it's not their fault. But this is how children interpret things. So I wanted to do it all my life. I had absolutely nothing, no tool. I had no name, no place, sealed records. And it wasn't until, and again, I had loving, supportive husband who kept saying, Janet, we'll hire someone, we'll pay anything, we'll find this out for you. But we had nothing to go on until finally I was talking with my adoptive mom, who I consider my mother, in my 60s. And I said, whatever happened to my adoption agency, assuming that it had long since closed? And she said, oh, it's still around, and there's even a website. And while I was on the phone with her, I Googled the website, and there it was, and I'm looking at it. And in the lower left-hand corner, there's this little tab that said search. And I clicked it, and for a fee of $650, they would reach out to your birth parent. And if both you and the birth parent agreed mutually, they would try and set up a reunion. And this was mind boggling to me, that because I had tried in college, I had tried to search, and I'd written to the agency, and they sent me back a very scrubbed letter giving me a little information that was helpful, but nothing. They basically, the letter was saying, don't ask these questions, they're not important. But apparently 3 years later, they started doing this unbeknownst to me.
Could I ask you a question about that, by the way?
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a reason, either during that time in general, like a financial incentive for the adoption agencies to not open these cans of worms? Because one of the things that I noticed a long time ago, before I ever saw any adopted parents, was that period where I think we were focusing more on genetics and health and history. And then adoption agencies started like being more willing, because for the people who are a part of the closed adoptions, more willing to share health information. And I thought to myself, is that like out of the genuineness of their hearts, or is that
There's no. There are laws. They had, and every state is different with the laws, but they had laws and agreements that they had to uphold, and so they it wasn't of the goodness of our heart. I don't think there's been any of that for the most part from these agencies. They're trying to protect their product and their business. But again, finally, at this point in my life, there was the ability to do this. I sent in my application. I heard that there was such a long waiting list that it would be about a year before they could get to my application. And true enough, that was the case. And ultimately, they found my birth mother very quickly, and she actually lived a couple towns away from me, but she refused to meet me. And that was something I never expected. I had been told all along by them that she was, mature and had, given me up as the best thing in my interest. And by the way, adoptees don't believe that when you're told that you were given away because you're so loved. It's like, wait, so love equals abandonment? I mean, it just doesn't ring true for those of us who are on the receiving end of that.
It's interesting you say that. I've heard that before. I have seen one case where that was actually true, where the kids went back and heard their parents' story of their time of their life, and it actually involved their parents being in a communist country, being politically pursued and potentially being killed. Like, I think I wonder whether like part of the reuniting for a lot of adopted kids, at least from their biological parents, should start with an apology.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I understand it. I mean, you understand that, back in the 50s, a teenager wasn't going to really successfully raise a child. It's like, not like you can't understand it, but I think I now especially understand more of the issue to be more a social issue and a cultural issue, that we're not doing enough. We spend 10 times as much on keeping children in foster care and giving them to stranger adoptions than it would cost us to keep them with their kins and kinship adoption. So there's values that are
What would
being,
that look like?
it's just really skewed values. It's not like, again, that's a societal judgment that's going on. And it's not like there's a wonderful book, Gretchen Sison wrote, called Relinquished, that really talks about the biological mother point of view. And she goes, and she's a sociologist from Harvard, and she goes into all the data and details here, but it is shocking to see what could be happening and what is happening. And I think it's very helpful for all of us to have our consciousness raised about that. But it's I think that the other thing a lot of people will say is, well, I'm worried about, two things. One, I never told my adoptive parents. They were in their 90s when I was searching, when I actively found, I shouldn't say searching. And I didn't want them to feel that I was replacing them. They're old, they're not well. I didn't think they were struggling more mentally at that point. And I didn't think they could handle it because it was hard for me to handle. But it was really just about me. It wasn't about how much I loved them, or I was still devoted to them. I took care of them, through to each of their deathbeds. I mean, but it was about me and my myself and my growth. And so I didn't tell them. I wish I could have. Maybe if they were younger, I would have shared it with them. It was too late to kind of tell them about the experience. But another thing I hear people say is they're worried about what they'll find. I'm worried about what I'll find, or what issues or problems are in that family. And my response to that is, you can't know yourself until you know the ugly with the good, the bad and the good. A baby born into a biological family isn't guaranteed a perfect family with no problems. That doesn't exist.
Yes,
And we expect them to just
win the parent lottery.
Yeah, handle what's given to you. And yet they act like adopted babies are somehow like these sensitive little beings that can't handle anything. And yet we're asking them to handle such trauma that we don't recognize. But when I finally met my birth mother, I mean, she denied me at first. It was crushing. It was absolutely crushing. But ultimately, 5 years later, I did meet her a few times, and it wasn't pretty. But I was glad. I still learned so much about myself from meeting her. And I don't think you can truly understand yourself. You have to gather all the pieces together. You have to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's only when you can kind of have this self-acceptance and this forgiveness to yourself, and this just, you can't only know happy things about yourself. That's not who you are. And so I'd say, if you're going to come through, and I think the only way out is through, if you're going to really face this and go there and figure out who you really are, the biological you along with the adoptive you have to know it all. And it's so hard to gather all those pieces together, but that's going to how you build this skeleton in you that you've grown up without. And it's building that structure within yourself that kind of helps hold you up ultimately when you're facing, in like you talked about grief, it's being adopted is to live eternally with grief. You are never really a part of your adoptive family. You're never really a part of your biological family. In one, you haven't shared blood, and the other, you haven't shared memory and experience. And you are alone. And you have to put all those pieces together to face that really terrifying feeling of, it's just me. And I lucky now to have a loving husband and two wonderful sons and a daughter-in-law, and even now a new granddaughter. And I'm so lucky, but my foundation wasn't built. And all that other love came late in life, came as an adult, and the damage was already done. And it took a lot of work to face all that and to deal with it and to integrate it. And, I've had siblings that have just, masked it, drank it, drugs, denial. Uh, but for me, the only way I could think of to heal myself and to help take away this really pain and a lot sadness and loneliness I just lived with was finding out the answers. Reading everything I could, researching what I could, searching. It was like if I could only once finally make a connection again with my blood, I would finally feel whole and could move forward in life. And I think that's what drives a lot of search, is that feeling of I've got to be whole again for a minute. I've got to find that my origin so I can feel whole and then move forward.
Do you think that did that for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you something. You had mentioned before, that idea of like around the point where I was saying some kids don't win the parent lottery biologically. It had me thinking, okay, so what is it? I know plenty of people who have either grown up or currently living in what I would say, or let's say, taking one thing as an example, emotionally abusive or neglectful households. Like I was talking to one recently and I was like, your childhood was a hellscape.
Mhm.
Um, and, but those kids don't necessarily get adopted. And I think for a variety of reasons. Maybe their families are so far off the grid or away from their own families, no one has insight into what's happening. So sometimes those kids don't end up anywhere other than the hellscape that they're in. Sometimes it's because people are so wealthy and they're insulated. And I'm wondering whether, like, on that latter group, there's a unique American deference to wealth that leads those people to not end up in the system. But if you're somewhere that I wonder internationally, are adoptions for the same reason? If we're so focused on the financial part of it, do adoptions happen all over the world for that same reason?
I think there are a lot of reasons for it in various countries and various situations, but I think that is a big part of it. A large part of it everywhere. Back when I was adopted, a large part of it was shame. I mean, premarital sex was just considered awful. People, families would disown a woman for it. It's hard for us to imagine now, but it was really serious. So a lot of it came from a culture of shame. But now it's really financial. A lot of it is really financial. A woman just doesn't have the resources to raise a child. Yes, there are also things like, illness or drug addiction. But again, that doesn't mean no one in that family, no aunt or uncle or grandparent could then take that, is healthy and could take that child and raise it. But there is so much about it that a woman not being able to keep a child now that's purely financial. And again, we're spending 10 times more instead of helping them with resources for that. We are spending 10 times more to put that child in foster care and then adopt them to strangers. I think many of the children adopted from foreign countries are from parents who are struggling financially as well. I don't have any personal experience with that, and um, just general information about that. But it certainly seems like, again, it's a it's a socioeconomic issue rather than a financial issue.
Before we got together, I was looking at this chart and it went back, I think, to the 1940s with available data. And in the 1940s, and maybe it's because they were collecting the data, right? Like there's some speculation in the report. You see this giant surge between the 1940s and the let's say 70s of all types of adoptions. And then you see a decline that kind of follows and then a bounce back. And then it starts to decline again after some more bounces around 2020. And I thought that was interesting because I would have thought that the decline started before then. What I did see was that non-relative adoptions had gone up in the 90s and then really sharply started to decline. But I'm wondering whether some of those things like those views of that there's something wrong with out of wedlock birth or other things like that are changing, because let me throw out there, right? Like if you were to list, if you gave me a list and said, who are the 10 both sort of like your peer age or below mothers, I would say 7, like the best moms I know, 7 out of 10 of them are actually single women.
Mm.
And that's an interesting thing to me. Like I was just telling one of them today, literally, that like your son is so unbelievably lucky to have you. And I can think of one over and over that those kids are so loved. Not that they don't have issues if their dad's not in the picture, and in several instances the dads are in the picture, but it's wild to me. I never really thought about that, actually. Like maybe we're wrong. We're wrong about what's really important. Like, is it really important that mom and dad are in the same home? Is it really important that
No, and I think again, if a mother can, has the resources to keep a child, even for, in Gretchen Sison's book, she talks about these points often in a birth mother's life where, even in some cases, a few $1,000s would get this woman through that point in life to a point where she would be able to raise this child and take care of it on her own. And birth mothers are devastated and haunted throughout the life for the loss they've experienced as well. I mean, I don't think anyone relinquishes a child easily and thoughtlessly. And it is also a trauma that affects them for the rest of their life. And we aren't recognizing and supporting the value and strength and ability for a woman to raise a child by herself, and we are not offering respect to the circumstances. It may be a struggling circumstance, but it's still, I argue, better for that child to be with their mother than to be with strangers. There's that the great example of um, a story that was written about how there was a little boy in the hospital and he was burned over 80% of his body, and he was crying for his mother. He was in great pain. He was burned all over his body. And he was crying for his mother. His mother was the one who had burned him. There is, and my mother used to talk about that all the time when my adopted mother, who was a math teacher for much of her life and in later life was a minister. And she said over and over again, children in very traumatic situations still want to be with that parent rather than be separated from them. Again, this really primal, no words for it, but feeling of that's who we are and where we are. And we don't value that enough. We think it's better to take that child and place them with strangers that are in a better, more financially stable home. And that's not what human beings need to be integrated people.
Yeah, like part of this sounds like it's a public policy and almost social psychology and sociological problem where our society is putting values on certain things. Do you have ideas from a public policy perspective what we could do? Because I imagine there are exceptions to the rule, right? Like there's
Of course.
there are definitely, if a child is in danger of death or serious bodily
Yeah, yep.
harm, there are going to be some, or I would say repeated danger, right? Because
Yeah,
accidents do
and that can
happen.
extend into the family. I mean, there are certainly situations where children need to find a family and be adopted. There are, there are some in the movement who want to, do away with adoption. I don't see how that's possible. Going back to your timeline, I mean, it was after really World War II that stranger adoption became a norm. Before that, children were cared for by relatives or even the wider community, and they weren't adopted out. It was something that started then, and it kind of, once birth control became a normal part of a woman's life, there was less commodity out there to be traded around. But I think that yes, we need adoption. There are certainly circumstances where a child needs another home, and I'm not saying to do away with adoption. I'm just saying let's be honest about it. Let's. I wish I knew growing up that I wasn't crazy,
Mm,
that the
mm.
things I was feeling and experiencing were normal for a person in my circumstances. It is normal when you are being raised by strangers to feel this way. There's nothing wrong with that. And I wish my parents knew that so that when they felt that disconnect too, they wouldn't go, oh, what we're failing, what's wrong with us for not being good parents? But they go, hey, it's normal to feel that way when we're raising someone else's child. And so if we had, if we could just recognize and honor the adoptee's experience and build from that so that we are offering both the that knowledge and hopefully relief to both the child and the adoptive parents and maybe the biology. Oh, and nowadays there's open adoption. But what I've recently discovered and was shocked to learn is that open adoptions are not legally binding. And at any point, and
Yeah, it's not as open. Yeah, it's not
no,
as clean as
it's
people
not,
think.
and usually they end up, the adoptive parents often end up, just, not honoring that anymore. And it's very painful. So there's nothing that protects that child right now to, to be inclusive of all the parts of themselves. So if we focused more on what does the child need to grow up better and then educate the adoptive parents and the birth parents on this whole process, I think we could come up with a better system that would better serve. And adoptees have 4 times the suicide rate of the normal population, and they think it's much higher than that. That is suicide attempts or ideology reported by adoptive parents who again don't know everything their kids are
Right,
going through.
certainly not. Right, no parent does.
And they're overrepresented adoptees in hospitalization for mental health and addiction.
It
It's
sounds like you're in many ways talking about a mental health crisis, because what I hear you sort of saying is like we need to give more support to people who are having children who are, let's say, fearful that they're going to be able to do it. We need to recognize and honor the trauma that people who are adopted um, go through, that we need to be creative about finding belonging. And I don't know whether you know other children when you were younger who were adopted. I wonder whether there is some, that notion of peer support, people who are walking in your shoes might be an important part of it. But I wanted to ask for your, and I think this question is usually phrased as like, what advice would you give adoptive parents? But I'm going to set that on the table for someone else. And, but like, what advice would you give to the 15-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 25-year-old, 50-year-old who's listening to this conversation and is trying to heal?
I would say listen to yourself, trust yourself. Your feelings aren't wrong, they're not crazy. You are experiencing an extraordinarily different experience of life than the other people, most of the other people in your world. If you were adopted, you've suffered from trauma. And I think listen to yourself and then get help. And some of the ways that I say you can get help is read about it. Read books, read The Primal Wound, read other books out there on the actual the data and the facts about being adopted and what that experience is. And then you won't feel so alone and you'll go, oh my God, it's not me. This is a thing that I should be feeling. There are now great online communities. There's such a large community out there online, and you can, find all sorts of voices again, and just learn more and reach out and keep pushing and keep asking for answers. You deserve them. You deserve to know who you really are and where you came from.
Mm.
And you deserve to see people who are like you, and keep pushing and asking, and just believe in yourself. Say, I am not wrong for feeling this way. This is what the reaction to this experience of life is. Find the answers and then get help processing them. I not only read a lot, but I got therapy. It's hard to process all this stuff. And you don't have to do it alone. There are a lot of people, especially therapists who specialize in adoption, who really know what you're experiencing. And so I think that's how I saved myself. And it was learning knowledge, gathering all the facts, gathering all the pieces of it, putting it together, and accepting it. It is grief you will live with for the rest of your life, but you will learn to live with it. It will never go away, but you'll accept it into your world and you'll walk beside it. And you will have so much a better feeling of strength and pride and forgiveness and love. It is a journey that is important to take, and I would urge everyone to do whatever it takes to find yourself in this, and to give your voice, and understand that your voice is important and it needs to be heard. And that's why I wrote my book, and it has been so gratifying to have so many adoptees come up to me and say, "Oh my God, thank you. You put words to my experience." As well as many people who said, "I had no idea. I never realized. And now I'm thinking about this in a new way." So again, I guess it's just trust yourself, trust your gut, and follow it to find answers.
One of the things I think I've learned in this long life, and working in mental health, I also work in other kinds of development throughout my career of people, is there are all these things that are very important. Like you'll often have this conversation with an introvert where they're like, yeah, I'm introverted, but we are relational people. Might hate it, but it's true. But I think about it almost like an anthropologist, right? Like humans are not the fastest animals. They're not the strongest. They don't have sharp teeth. We don't have claws. We would have all been eaten by lions and hyenas if we couldn't form clans and teams and
Mhm.
things like that. And so I've thought a lot about what is the most important thing for people to find fulfillment and live good lives. And I've realized that there's so many things that we need, but the one that we need above all else, certainly safety and security keeps us alive, but the one that we need above all else that also feeds safety and security. That's why Maslow should have put this at the bottom of his chart and the top of it. It's belonging,
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
feeds everything,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
I think you made some really powerful points, and I appreciate the conversation. I'm going to give you a chance to make any closing, thoughts, because I think this is probably an important message for adoptive parents, for people who are considering giving their children up for adoption, for people who are adopted. But this notion that you're talking about a sense of belonging and history and culture and connection to other humans, I think it's an important lesson for everyone, because I think in what was missing for you, I think many of us can see what maybe we're taking for granted. Um,
Yeah, yes, I agree with that very much. I would say the takeaway is adoption is trauma, and you have to educate yourself on what it feels like to have all of that taken, to have all of your belonging, your rights, your birthright to your heredity and to your family taken away from you. And understanding what that's like, hopefully we can try and structure things better going forward. But also, you'll be better equipped to make decisions and in the voting booth about opening adoptee records in your state, or the issues of donor conceived individuals or reproductive rights. But it also appreciate. A lot of people say, "Oh, I don't get along with my family, or I choose my friends or my family," and that's true, and that's fine. I get that, but also, you wouldn't be who you are if you hadn't grown up around them and you didn't know that information. You didn't have those facts to push against. So, hopefully appreciating and trying to get us all to understand the biology of belonging and identity. That it's so important that biology of belonging and identity is something that we need to recognize and honor and
Value it.
value it. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about sort of everything you're saying. One takeaway for me is like, we need to accept what this is, and maybe we need to recalibrate our equation in making decisions like this. So I just want to close by thanking you. I think that was a really powerful and interesting conversation. And I hope you get a chance to share your message far and wide. And I certainly hope people take a look at your book, and that, our listeners who are listening, or my listeners who are listening, who are adopted or comforted by it, and those who aren't can become educated, informed by it. So just thank you, Janet, for being vulnerable enough to open up your feelings and share them.
Well, thank you for a great conversation and some really wonderful insight as well.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for joining us for this powerful conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again soon.
This is your before and after story. Southeastern College can help you prepare for a secure and fulfilling career in the growing healthcare field. We offer a wide range of careers to choose from. So whether you want to be a medical assistant, medical billing and coding specialist, nurse, surgical technologist, or another healthcare career, we've got you covered. Become a vital part of a healthcare team and make a real difference. Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sec.edu to get started.